Good evening, everyone. I'm Eve Kahn. I'm head of the Grolier Club Special Functions Committee. Thank you. I love my job because the most amazing people who've made incredible discoveries about the history of the printed word and image reach out to us, or we reach out to them, sometimes completely out of the blue, and they bring their books here and they tell us about how their books came to be. Their books are magic, including the one that we have for sale this evening, because this is a book collecting club. And I am not going to take up much of your time here tonight. I'm just so excited to learn more about how 10 by 10 brought Flashpoint to be. So this is a unique hybrid club, library, museum. We have a spectacular show about Mark Twain up now, and please keep an eye on our Eventbrite because we have tons of great events like this coming up. I have two things to do tonight. One is to thank Dave Solo, who's not here tonight, but who's a board member of 10 by 10. Who's on the Grolier Club's council with me. He couldn't be here, but he is here in spirit because one of the great things he does is he makes problems go away here, and he prevents problems from coming in here in his role as the head of the House Committee and members of countless other committees and endeavors here. So I'm just going to introduce her tonight. Karen Kertész-Sklar, who is manager of 10 by 10's Photobooks Salon, and I'm not going to take up any more time. I just can't wait to learn more about how this spectacular book that we have for sale here this evening with authors to sign it came to be. Welcome to the podium, Karen. Thank you, the entire 10 by 10 team, for getting this amazing packed house together. And I'm going to get out of the way now. Thank you so much. Welcome, Karen.
Hi. I'm Karen Kertész-Sklar. I manage the 10 by 10 salons with founders Russell Letterman and Olga Yatskovich. Dave Solo runs our grants program, and Jeff Gutterman helps with photography and publications. Shay Bosch and Queenie Shen are our 2025 work scholars. We're very happy to be hosting this salon at the Grolier Club. A big thank you to Eve Kahn, Declan Keeley, and April Rose of the Grolier Club for hosting this event. Also a big thank you to Dave Solo, 10 by 10 member and Grolier member, who suggested the topic for this talk. For those of you who don't know 10 by 10 Photobooks, we're a community-oriented organization that advocates the engagement with the photo book through its focus on contemporary practice and overlooked publications in photo book histories. If you like what we do, please consider donating to 10 by 10 via our website, 10by10photobooks.org. Thank you for joining us for tonight's panel discussion with archive specialist Arthur Fournier, photographer Kris Graves, and scholar Kyle Canter on the relationship of photography with text and protest materials in print. Featuring examples from 10 by 10 Photobooks, new anthology, Flashpoint, Protest Photography in Print, 1950 to present, and beyond, the speakers will explore the recent history of protest photography in print worldwide and how the intersection of photography and text shaped both the making and reception of the material, from photo books, zines, posters, pamphlets, independent journals, and alternative newspapers. Since its inception, photography has captured defining historical moments, serving as either a tool or a document of protest, or both. Often combined with text, such as essays, poetry, captions, or diary entries to tell stories or make arguments, photography has served this purpose through extreme social and cultural transformations. Right now, we are at multiple flashpoints in American history, and there is much to learn from the examples of Arthur, Kris, and Kyle from tonight. Arthur will go first, followed by Kris and then Kyle. Following the final presentation, there will be a Q&A with the three presenters and my 10 by 10 colleague, Russell Letterman. Also, if you wish to buy a copy of Flashpoint or Kris Graves' books, you can do so at the back of the room. I'd also like to mention that our next salon will be on Tuesday, March 25th at the New York Public Library. In collaboration with the Wallach Division, we will host presentations by Carmen Winnett and Marriott Pathy Allen, so mark your calendars. An e-blast with registration details will go out 2 weeks prior to the event. Now to introduce our speakers. Arthur Fournier is an independent broker of 20th century archives and a member of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, who focuses on primary source materials from the late 20th century, including underground serials, self-published books, and ephemera that provide an alternative bibliographic view of contemporary life and revolutionary struggle. Kris Graves is an American photographer who examines systemic unfairness in the United States. Using a mix of conceptual and documentary practices, Graves photographs the subtleties of societal power and how racism and capitalism can be seen and experienced in everyday life. His recent publications include RNC DNC, Privileged Mediocrity, and Oblique Reality. Kyle Canter is a PhD student in art history at the CUNY Graduate Center. His research interests include the concept and politics of social documentary photography and photography's relationship to the medical humanities and gender sexuality studies. His writing has appeared in 125th Street Photography in Harlem, the Journal of Black Mountain College Studies, and Flashpoint Protest Photography in Print, 1950 to present. Please welcome Arthur.
I am delighted to be here, and I want to thank Dave, Olga, Russet, and all of you for inviting me to share what I know and share what I've learned about text, image, and kind of this particular nexus of photography and, I guess, textual framing that happens in underground materials in the post-war period. It's something that I have learned about through the praxis of being a dealer. I don't want to represent myself as a scholar, so my talk will not be scholarly. It'll be rooted in my own experiences. And in a way, I'm going to recount something of my own history of encounters with materials like these through my practice in the rare book trade, which began in the Boston area in 2009 when I moved there from Brooklyn to become a rare bookseller, and I worked with Peter Burnett, who is a bookseller who is the owner of a company called F.A. Burnett Books, and they work also very much with scholarly libraries, and so I learned book cataloging, and I learned about graphic art, the printed image and the printed text. Insofar as I have a bibliographic training, it would have been through Peter and Larry Malum, who is his business partner. And so that's the basis of how it is that I'm standing here today, maybe about 15 years after I started working for Peter as a cataloger in about 2009. So I am struck by what I would call the aesthetics of urgency. This is what always speaks to me most vibrantly when I'm encountering materials, particularly materials that are self-made or produced by communities who perhaps are not well-resourced or do not have experts at their disposal to combine texts and images, but they feel as if they have a message that needs to get out, and that's typically because lives are at stake or a grave injustice is happening. And so I really always respond to this on a visceral level, but I think there's a brilliant quote here from Emory Douglas, who all of us in this room should be familiar with, but he was the Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, and he's an incredible visual artist himself. But he wrote about this particular feeling that inhabits and I think sort of animates certain works of art, about art is a language communicating with the community. The sense of urgency comes from what we had seen and what we're doing. The fact was that we could be wiped off the map at any given time. The urgency in the artwork was a reflection of the urgency in the race and the fear that people had. you had to be accessible to the community and interpret them into the art, like making the people heroes on the stage. And if you're familiar with the incredible poster work and graphic art of Emery Douglas, you can feel that urgency. And of course, you know, he's talking about his own work, and he's talking about the work of the Black Panther Party community newspaper in that quote, but I think it is very broadly applicable to the kinds of images and the kinds of graphic art that I want to talk about in my portion of tonight's event. And so, you know, I guess what we're really also here to think about is, you know, what does it mean to encounter not an original work of art, right, but a reproduction of an artwork or a photograph, right? I mean, we know that, you know, that there are these tools at our disposal, and we can use them intentionally to distribute information. And Walter Benjamin wrote, you know, an essay that, again, I think we're all familiar with to a certain extent, about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproducibility. And Benjamin talked about how, what does that do to the original work of art? What does that do to an artwork in a museum, you know, perhaps inaccessible to us where we live, that we can look at it, we can view it in a palm-sized picture postcard or in a book. You know, what does that do to our relationship to the original work of art if we may never see it, but we may develop kind of a cognitive relationship with it, or an emotional or spiritual relationship with that work of art? He talked about the creation of aura and about the establishment of kind of a cult value for the original artwork. So I want to use that same paradigm that Walter Benjamin is talking about with the work of art in the age of mechanical reproducibility, and also bring it to bear on the act of political violence, or the act of oppression, or the act of resistance to political violence, or the act of resistance to oppression in the age of mechanical reproducibility, which is simply to say that if there is no trace record or evidence of my violence against you, particularly as a state actor, I can operate with impunity. If I can erase you and erase any picture of me erasing you, you know, it's not a problem for me. I can operate with that psychopathic level of kind of power and domination and control. But if somebody takes a picture of it, if someone documents it and creates a powerful record of what's happening, and it's incontrovertible, that can change things, particularly if that image of the act of political oppression, or the act of resistance to political oppression, can travel rapidly throughout the culture because of a mechanical reproduction. And since we're here to talk about the relationship between text and image, I thought that I would bring to bear one particular work of photographic protest art that, you know, just really hit me viscerally when I first encountered it when I was working for F.A. Burnett Books in Boston. And it's right here. It is a picture from 1968, which was taken by a photographer. I got his name here, I'm sorry. I apologize if I'm being a little bit ad hoc tonight. I've just had one of those weeks when I didn't have as much time to prepare for a talk like this as I like to. His name is Ronald Haberly. It was taken on March 16, 1968, and it shows about a dozen dead and partially unclothed South Vietnamese women and children in contorted positions, stacked on the ground. They'd been killed by US forces, and the picture's overlaid with this kind of semi-transparent blood red text that asks, Q and babies? And it answers, A and babies. And the quote was actually from a Mike Wallace interview, television interview on CBS with a soldier who had been at the site of the massacre. And he confirmed that this picture was accurate, and he confirmed that the US soldiers had killed with impunity. And to me, there is no more powerful and moving overlay of text and image that I have encountered. You know, kind of perfectly simple, straightforward text and an absolutely horrific image that I have encountered in my work as a bookseller and a dealer of ephemera. And I wanted to actually bring that into the space in this room right now, because it would feel, I think, disingenuous to be talking in a purely academic sense about this kind of injustice, because, you know, in our own time, the question should still be and babies, and the answer is still very much and babies. So that radicalized me. I think that was one of the things that radicalized me when I was coming to the book trade, thinking about something as powerful as that, and about how it was somehow hidden and secreted into these flat file trays in museums, and this was not an image that circulated very widely. But at the time that it was made, it had tremendous power, and it changed people, it moved people, and it was part of an effort by culture workers to end the war in Vietnam through moral shaming of the American public. And so I wanted to bring this image up. It's actually an image that is just about 15 years old, of a blog that I used to write for Peter Burnett in Boston, and it was called Rectoverse, and it was my way of giving myself a forum to talk about text and image that I encountered in the work there in the cataloging room at F.A. Burnett. And based on a collection of similar kinds of material, I put together this post, which was called Radical Newspapers and the Graphic Design of Urgency. And it was my attempt to try to examine this relationship between, you know, sort of non-expert graphic design and images and newspapers and mimeographs and posters, and, you know, that were issued typically by students and workers. And so that was about, you know, maybe a real beginning point for me in terms of thinking about this. And it was probably the first time that I started working out some of the ideas that I'm discussing here today. But there's another kind of node in my own personal development around this topic, whereas after I moved back to New York, I had an opportunity to mount an exhibition at Fortnight Gallery in the East Village, run by two brilliant women, Fabiola Alondra and Jane Harmon. The gallery is no longer in operation, but I think it's one of those galleries that's really going to be remembered as an important place, because they invited sort of outsiders in a way to mount exhibitions. And they asked me if I wanted to do something, and I said, yeah, I'd love to put together this package of material that I found relating to sort of poetry and graphic art from you know, the 1967, and I'd like to use a quote from Eldridge Cleaver's 1968 run for the presidency, which was, "The spirit of the people will be stronger than the pig's technology," which I thought was great. And I thought, because I put this exhibition together in 2017, that we could ask 50 years later, well, is it? Has it been? Has the spirit of the people been stronger than the pig's technology? And I think, what is the pig's technology is a different question today than it was in 1967. In 1967, maybe it was television, and maybe it was computers that were being used to run program bombing raids in Cambodia. But now, you know, we all walk around with a device in our hands that is designed to be addictive. It's also designed to be surveillance equipment. It's designed to help us communicate, but it is also very clearly and intentionally designed to limit our communication around certain topics, because the owners of the devices, you know, that we use, the designers of these devices, don't want us talking about certain things, and there is a sort of algorithmic control over the circulation of certain texts and certain images today. So it's just important to be thinking about this, to be thinking about who we are as a public, how our relationship to one another in communities, how that relationship is always mediated by outside forces. And do we have some control over those forces, or do those forces have control over us? And so that's what the real question at the root of this exhibition was. And it was a pretty exceptional opportunity for me to to bring out some of these kind of graphic art objects that I had collected, particularly around the artists and writers militia, which is something that was created by Ben Maria, who people probably know better as the founder of Black Mask, if they know him at all. But Black Mask was a newspaper that borrowed its title from a Frantz Fanon book. And it engaged with not only the history of the civil rights struggle in its time, 1966 to 1968, but it also engaged with the longer history of Dada and Surrealism and the avant-garde being used as tools of political liberation. And so I want to show you a picture of the cover of the Ben Marais magazine, Black Mask. That's issue number 4. There is a picture of a Black Mask protest where men and women in balaclavas holding skulls on sticks and signs that say, "Wall Street is War Street." And that magazine ran 10 issues. Most of them had some kind of a photographic image on the cover or the interior contents. And it used this incredibly stark, sober as, you know, the break of day, kind of text overlay in a very stark layout that just didn't, you know, it's, I would say, fairly humorless, but it's absolutely, it's meant to wake you up. It's meant to kind of startle you, to confront you with a picture and to confront you with a message. And I think that's a really powerful thing to have innovated in its own time. Basically Maria and his collaborators at the time they were producing Black Mask were very much aware of their precursors in kind of the Dada and Surrealist movement, but they ended up taking it into more of a protest territory than an aesthetic territory. So I'm going to move forward and show you more images that are complex interweavings of text and photography. Strike Anywhere Beyond the Barricade, Fire. This was made by the Berkeley Barricade group, which was related to Ben Marais and Black Mask. We'll move forward past that, because one of the things I want to talk about here, these are all handbills. These were things that were given out by hand in their time, right? And we live in a time where, again, we have a relationship between text and image that's mostly mediated by our smartphones in terms of the information we're gathering on a daily basis, or the sort of political memes we might encounter or that we might miss on any given day. But as recently as 2010, we had this magazine, the Occupied Wall Street Journal, that when people really realized, look, the algorithm is being used to control certain messagings. Let's make a parody of a newspaper and let's use it and hand it out to people on Wall Street. And so this is an interior spread of the Occupied Wall Street Journal from 2011. The whole world isn't just watching. And that's the idea, is that if we can wake up and we can get past just watching, maybe there will be more informed moral action by a group. So more spreads from the interior of the Occupied Wall Street Journal. And I want to bring us to this newspaper that is now being circulated in New York City to great controversy. This is something called the New York War Crimes, made by a group of people who are powerfully moved to confront mass murder of civilians in Gaza at present, and want to point out that the New York Times itself, with its kind of position of authority in terms of how it relates images to texts, has perhaps failed its duty to really alert us to what's going on. So they use that kind of authoritative look of the New York Times, they re-edit it, and they bring this to our attention in ways that feel differently than maybe they would if they were just online, because these are actual newspapers that you can get at a protest action over 2024 and 2025. So these are more covers of the New York war crimes. Rights are what we make and what we take until all of us are freed. So you can see they're taking a historic image of the civil rights struggle and the Black Panthers, and they're bringing it into the moment of the struggle against apartheid and genocide today. And there's another picture of the cover of the New York War Crimes. I just thought this was an interesting example of something that's in circulation at this moment. So I want to come back to this image because I know I don't have that much time. We have other really interesting talks to start to consider. But this, again, is just an image that absolutely changed my life, I would say, in that relationship between the image and the text and how stark it was. And then here's another less well-known image from that same time that says 4 more years, 4 more years. And I think it also, there's a historic echo with that for me. So here we are, 4 more years. I know that it looks like I've only got about a minute left, so I'm gonna wrap up. But I would urge everyone who's got a smartphone or a subscription to the London Review of Books to read an essay by T.J. Clark, an art historian who has a lot of interesting things to say about the relationship between texts and images. He was a member of the Situationist International, and they were famous for renegotiating or declaring that all relationships between all texts and images were up for renegotiation. And he said, those who first thought seriously about the society of the spectacle did not imagine it would last. They wrote in a time of upheaval, believing that the world had already grown tired of its reflection. Species being, they were nothing if not devotees of the early marks, would reassert itself. They could not anticipate the spell would be cast through the half-century by speeding up and miniaturizing the image, putting the spectacle at everyone's fingertips, making it a form of life. Those who lived to see it often despaired. The depth of the situation is contempt for the mass production of appearances, read now, could be grating. We've all been taught to be wary of condescension. But perhaps it is time to be less circumspect. If Trump is what the image world has revealed itself to be, if he's the society that we have settled for, looming against us, cruel and false and ugly, and determined to destroy, then what is left but to fight to the finish, a plan of campaign with spectacle, the enemy, not derision, but tactics. And this is where I think we are today, where we have to think tactically about the relationship between word and image. We have to think not just with our smart screens, our smartphone screens and posting on social media. We have to think about producing text and image objects like the Occupied Wall Street Journal, like the New York War Crimes, and like other kind of interesting and fun examples that I would be happy to discuss with you after this talk is over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Next, we're going to have Kris Graves come up and give a little talk.
All right. What's up, y'all? Look at all these people. It's awesome. So many people. Friday night, y'all. My name is Kris Graves. I know a bunch of you guys, but not everybody. I run a publishing company in Queens, New York. I'm from Queens also, so I big up to the New Yorkers. And I've been running the publishing company since 2009 when we made our first book. Our first set of books came out around 2010 after I did 2 years of trying to figure out if I could sell my own stuff. And then we moved it into like working with other artists, and we've been text heavy ever since. We try every year to make a book that is poetry and photography driven in both ways. So we've been familiar with like putting text in books for a long time. Yes, so this book is by a photographer named Marilyn Rye, who was doing poetry as well as trying to get back as close as she could to Afghanistan, where she was born and her parents were missionaries, which became a second book that we made years later because that story is insane. But this is one of our first books. And yeah, this is me just like going to Strand for about a year straight to try to figure out what papers existed, called 100 presses to try to price things out because I couldn't afford a damn thing. And finally got to making books after many years. But yeah, so text for us is really important. I mean, our press really focuses on cultural projects that deal with, gentrification, sexuality, poetry, and culture. Anything cultural. So, that's kind of where we focus our energy. We also make large sets of books, or not large, but like every few years we make a set named Lost, which is photographers photographing places that they're very familiar with. Our text, we try to focus on text that's not about the artist in the books, but more about adding to the photos. So it's usually about a writer looking at the photographs and then developing their own kind of narrative about what they're seeing, and not really about like this photographer's doing this thing. Like we try to stay away from that type of writing completely, actually. But yeah, so every few years we make these huge sets with a bunch of artists. 20 artists at once, this is maybe too much, but it turned out pretty good. And this year we made another set, or last year, I guess, with 10 artists photographing 10 places during COVID. After COVID, we started working with a designer named Kyle Canter, who has taken our press to a different level, because before that it was me designing and doing everything myself, and I don't have any history in design, so I was just kind of putting things together like I saw old photo books were. But now we have a guy that actually does work like this and just kind of sits around and thinks about like how to put text into images in a way. This book is called Stranger Fruit by a photographer named John Henry. And John went around the country photographing mothers with their play-dead black sons as pietas around, I think he went to about 40 states and photographed this. And every mother has text in the book that are next to, kind of next to their own images. And what we wanted to do with a piece of this book, which you can't really see, but our designer made this like little dashed code on the side. You can see it starts to form words. I just want to show you what that looks like in person, but he's in that. And the press is low. But yeah, so when you, we were able to make this, he was able to make this code into like words on the edge of the book, which I thought was like super cool. So if you want to check that out, please let me know. And always I've been working very, everybody can hear me, right? This thing's I hate hearing myself talk, so it's just So this is called A Bleak Reality. It's this big. What I wanted to do is produce a book that, well, this book is pretty much 8 scenes where black people were killed by police officers, kind of Mississippi and east of, except for Minneapolis. But what we wanted to do with this book is I wanted to make a book that was the size of like our exhibition prints, so 2024 exhibition prints. And every other page, well, every two pages of photos, and then backed by the story from the photo before and the photo after. And the series is, I went to these places over the course of, I had a full-time job, so I was just kind of like going around every weekend trying to photograph as many as I could find, and there's so many, which is sad, and I photographed at the exact same time as they were murdered. So it was a hard project, but it got me into the American landscape in a way that I never thought I would be in, but if you want to check this book out, it's here. So yeah, so I've been working with designers, and I always thought that, for me, photography is trying to figure out how to not have text, need text in photographs. I always wanted to make work that you actually didn't need the text, but a project like this, these scenes are almost nothing. They're nothing. Like this is where Tamir Rice died, but how would you know that without the text? So it was really important for us to kind of include text on the same level of importance as the photographs were. So big, bold, and that's what we did with this book. This book came out in 2019. I'm a small run press. We usually make under 500 of a book, and we made 200 of these because we couldn't afford more. They sold out, so we made 200 more. But yeah, so that was our little magazine, is what we call it, our enormous magazine. My next book is called Privileged Mediocrity. And this is kind of intense. This is like a big book. There's 3 parts of this book. The first part, but yeah, so under this slipcase is, well, pretty much this is like a Confederate history lesson. And we put our little Confederate flag hidden under the cover, just for everybody. But anyhow, so the first part of this book is kind of what I call a chronological history of American issues in the landscape. If you can't read this, but it says Christopher Columbus, or Christopher Colombo, discoverer of America, under these native heads. So I thought that was this project is probably the first project where text within the image became really important for me. Before that I was trying to filter out all ads and all text from images, actually. So this time it was completely different, because it just serves the ridiculousness of what I'm seeing. Stonewall Jackson died in Virginia, friendly fire during kind of towards the end of the Civil War. They tried to amputate his arm to save his life, but it didn't work. He died somewhere else, but they buried his arm. And this is kind of, so it says like, arm of Stonewall Jackson here. You'll see a picture of me next to actual Stonewall Jackson. But like, it's like crazy, weird things like this. Government property, so we're paying taxes for this, for sure. So my problem with the like Confederacy was like, we still pay taxes for it. I don't like that. I mean, private property, do what you want. But anyway. And a bit of the bleak reality is in this book also. A few pictures from there where you're seeing like where Alton Sterling was kind of killed by police officers right here at the same part of the night as I was there in Baton Rouge. Juxtapositions of like a childhood diptych. The middle of this book, okay, so the first book is like, the first part's about 30 images, 30 plates. The middle of this book, we changed the paper color and the paper completely to black. And there was an Ida B. Wells book named Southern Horrors, and we wanted to kind of use that as a base of a title, where now we have a kind of 2,000-word essay in here. And what I did was went around for 30 days photographing every Confederate monument I could find in 8 states across the South. And I found, I think, about 200. There's about 2,000, so I only saw 10%, but I felt like that was enough. A lot of my assistant or my friends sitting in a car with the car on, ready to go out of the scenes is what it was. But as you can see, we found a lot of beautiful things like this, where the racism just kind of is palpable. But the weird thing is, we made this kind of history of the Confederate monuments and like the stories behind how they're there, why they're there, and yeah, it's weird. When I look back at this project, I consider it like kind of right in the middle. It's not like a book for the Democrat or the Republican. It's like it sits right in the historic middle, where you can like this book if you're you can love this if you're any. There's nothing telling me that you shouldn't love these Confederate monuments in this book. Trying to step back from these scenes, give you a bit of text and some kind of understanding of what I'm looking at. The third part of this book is the revolt. So like summer of 2020, photographing during Richmond first. A lot of it's from Richmond, but then we went on this road trip and photographed all across the South, where text is everywhere. And like Edmund Pettus Bridge, this guy, this bridge is super important for the the 3 marches from Selma to Montgomery. And what I didn't know, Edmund Pettus was the Grand Wizard of the KKK for many years before he got this bridge named after him, and the name's still on the bridge. Anyhow, there's fun stuff everywhere. Everywhere. But yeah, so this book is like a 3-part, and like, you randomly find stuff in the field. I was just driving along and, oh, Robert E. Lee High School. They actually took the name down, and then they renamed it. So that's happening in the South as well, where we're renaming things after Confederates. And that's going to continue, I think, now with our Vice President. Anyhow, so yeah, we end this little book with Stonewall Jackson actually buried in a field next to his house. After that, we have the DRC. I went out to the DRC and DNC and RNC this year. I was photographing. Well, this year I've been photographing. Last year I was photographing gerrymandering across the swing states, which is like the most boring project ever. But at the end of the day, I think I made some pictures. Who knows? I don't know if anyone will ever see them. But anyhow, I kind of did that at the same time as these conventions were happening, so I could go on the streets and kind of photograph what I saw. I'm not familiar with. I don't really photograph people on the street very often. My life is photographing landscapes and then photographing family and friends in the studio and outside. But this is the first time I actually just walked up to strangers in my whole life and photographed them. Yes, so these are kind of these books, and there's text all over the place. There's not much text in these books, but as far as the images are concerned, people are wearing their text. They're very clear about who they were, and there's text within all these images. So I think it says a lot. Revolt is about text, really. I think if you go to any sort of rally, you're going to see a ton of text. And for me, it was important to try to make a picture that wasn't a documentary photograph in some way. I don't know if I've actually been successful doing that, but try to build a landscape that wasn't just the kind of documentary photographs we always see. That's I think Hezbollah flag this guy has here. A lot of stuff happening out there. But yeah, I mean, for me, text gives us a little bit more to think about in all these books. I mean, really hard to make a photo book without text. So we will continue. But yeah, so this is the DNC, Chicago, and you can see the kind of, well, there's people of color in this book, so that's one difference. There's this, which is not him, but very close, very strange. And with these books, we try to mirror a lot of things. So the front page is like kind of similar, the back page is similar. So then RNC is a little bit different, a little bit more in your face, which it felt like on the streets as well, of Milwaukee. Far more confrontational and, you know, obviously confrontational. I didn't really understand like who this was for. I didn't know if it was like, whose side is this? Like, who does this? What is? There's some wild shit happening out there. I did have a good time for like talking to all these people, but like, wild. This lady. They were going all in. They did not care. I mean, and they were like so happy to get their photograph taken too. So it was like really nice. And so next time you're at a rally, just remember that people do want to be seen, especially if they're wearing shit like this. Some little fights between these guys. I actually found out the dude on the left is a gay porn star, and that was like really, that was funny. Anyhow. Yes. So I don't know how much time I have. Do I have time? 5 minutes? Yeah. Well, I'm gonna run out quicker than that. Well, while we were there, we also had like the first day of the RNC, 2 or 4 Ohio cops ran up to a homeless person on the street who was fighting with someone in the middle of the street with a knife and shot him out of jurisdiction. Nothing ever happened to those guys, but there was a vigil that night. Yeah, this is kind of our American problem. But yeah, this is like the most text I've ever seen in any of my images. It's crazy to actually look back and see like how much there is. But yeah, then it ends with this lady again who I found randomly on the street. But yeah, that's kind of what we do with text here. I'm willing to talk to you about anything else, but we're about 100 and so books in now after about 16 years, and we're gonna keep it going. Our next books next books can get us canceled for sure. They come out very soon. We're making a book about the West Bank and what it looks like right now, as well as what Cairo, Egypt has looked like over the transition in the last 20 years. So those come out next month. So check them out, and don't tell the cops. Thank you.
Thank you, Kris. Okay, Kyle, you're up.
I just wanted to thank everybody at 10x10 and the Grolier Club for organizing this. And yeah, I'm gonna get started. So my presentation will examine the use of text in a selection of photo books and print material dealing with protests spanning across regions and revolutions from the 1950s to 2011. As Russet Letterman and Olga Yaskovich write in the introduction of Flashpoint, print material not only extends the reach of protests to include those who were not present at demonstrations, but it also reshapes the very definition of what protests can be. Distributing publications that circumvent censorship or contest official narratives of historical events also constitutes a form of protest, and the use of text within these publications remains a vital framework through which to analyze revolutionary methods. As opposed to the use of photography and propaganda, where the mainstream press often reproduce alongside clear-cut captions that inscribe a singular meaning to the image, much of the text printed in political photo books compiled by artists remains open to interpretation. Some of the publications within Flashpoint reproduce photographs with standard captions, but intersperse them between poems, love letters, and propaganda posters, as is the case with Nazim Hikmet's La Conga Confidel, or they reproduce photographs alongside no text at all following a personal essay, as in Matthew Connor's Fire in Cairo, or Moses Salman's Discordia. Tonight, I'm going to talk about 4 photographic publications that use text in both similar and novel ways, but that all converge as examples that broaden the political possibilities of pairing text with image. So here's the first publication I'm going to talk about. The British photojournalist and documentary filmmaker Anthony Howarth decided to make Kenyatta a photographic biography upon witnessing the influence colonial propaganda had on the story of Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of the newly formed Kenyan Republic in 1963. Rather than serve as a complete and detailed biography of Kenyatta, the photo book lays out his life in pictures. Howarth intersperses pictures of Kenyatta with historical photographs, newspaper clippings, and political cartoons and critical text that help contextualize the British colonial system and worldview that impacted his life. By identifying Kenyatta as a leading figure in the politics of a decolonizing African continent, rather than as an instigator of violence as portrayed by the sensationalized 1950s British press, Howarth created his photo book in 1967 as an act of protest against colonial narratives. Here, it is important to reference another photo book discussed in Flashpoint, Mau Mau, a pictorial record, published by the English press in Nairobi in 1953, using photographs by Jack Yowell, a freelance photographer for NBC News. This book depicts the outbreak of the Mau Mau uprising, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army struggle for independence, fought from 1952 to 1960 from a colonial perspective. Mau Mau are framed as so-called terrorists in an attempt to sway global opinion from Kenyan autonomy. As historian Miles Osborne has shown, the British were worried about the circulation of anti-colonial publications both inside and outside Kenya, so they sought to counter these narratives with their own propaganda. On the other hand, Howarth published Kenyatta through an independent publishing house established by the former British colonial officer John Nottingham. After leaving his post at the colonial office in 1967, Nottingham founded East African Publishing House and primarily published the work of African writers. Nottingham became increasingly outspoken about the injustices he witnessed under the colonial system, advocating for Mau Mau veterans in various lawsuits. Under Nottingham's guidance and through a decolonial perspective, Howarth compiled his photographic documents around a new narrative that protest stories told by publications such as Mau Mau, a pictorial record. Kenyatta, a photographic biography, moves chronologically and is laid out in 9 sections, with each section indicated by the same bold font used on the cover. The book starts with the emergence of the British colony around the turn of the 20th century. And here we're looking at an early spread that presents 2 panoramic photographs. On the top, we're seeing the opening ceremony with white settlers of the Uganda Railway, and underneath it, we're seeing a photograph of a condensing plant at the same railway with Black Indian workers. Even though there's no text used within this spread, it acts as a text itself. The juxtaposition, it visualizes the divide and oppression under colonial rule, and it also foretells impending colonization by way of the railroad, which extended the territory of European control. Following sections trace Kenyatta's ascendance as a young politician, his travels and advocacy for Kenyan independence throughout Europe in the 30s and 40s, and his subsequent return to Kenya in 1946, when he was elected as the head of the Kenyan African Union. In 1953, Kenyatta was arrested with other KAU members, known as the Kapinguriai Six, for their alleged involvement with the Mau Mau uprising. In the trial and detention section, Howarth pairs a photograph of internment camps surrounded by barbed wire with press photographs of the arrests and documents calling for the liquidation of Kenyatta and his political allies. The word liquidated is emphasized both in the annotation on the document and within the caption, a process of elimination punctuated by the photograph of death and destruction in the following pages. The final section of the book presents an emboldened transition upon Kenyatta's release in 1961 and presidential election in 1964. A behind-the-scenes shot of Kenyatta appears as he poses for a portrait by Alfred Eisenstadt, a life photographer who previously photographed the president during his incarceration. The remaining 15 pages are filled with pages with photographs of Kenyatta and Kenyan citizens in a restored period of liberation. Historical text and captions are absent with the final section of the photo book, and photographs are reproduced as full lead spreads. The lack of text here is functionally liberating, as the viewer is now free to flip through their images and form their own meanings from a newly informed perspective. Published 3 years after Kenya gained independence from British rule, the final section brings the viewers to the publication's present. Perhaps the lack of text indicates that this is a story still being written. All right, now I'm going to talk about the second publication. The French photographer, Gilles Perez, created Telex Iran after spending 6 weeks in Tehran, Iran from December 1979 to January 1980 on assignment for Magnum Photos. A group of images of the event circulated across Western media outlets under the bold headline. A group of students from the University of Toronto had recently taken over the United States Embassy, and images of the event circulated across Western media outlets under the bold headline, "The Iranian Hostage Crisis." Within the media, text and image were paired to heighten anti-Iranian sentiment. Having come of age during the Vietnam and Algerian wars, two heavily photographed and televised wars, and studying philosophy with Michel Foucault at university, at a time when Foucault was formulating his ideas on power and surveillance, Perez became increasingly critical of these publicized narratives. Seeking to circumvent the press's censorship of geopolitical events, Perez traveled to Tehran to attempt to understand the situation's complexity through his own personal viewpoint. Telex Iran begins with a photograph of various newspapers scattered across a tabletop, reflecting the frenzy of reportage around the hostage crisis. Perez's own materials are shown at the bottom right of the composition. We see his ID, contact sheets, and messages with his editors. Materials that were used to produce the photo book. The blur of the magnifying glass symbolizes the photographer's critical point of view, even when looking at his own images. The point of view perspective orients us to our own position as viewers, as consumers of media. Throughout the rest of the photo book, the nonlinear sequencing, tilted angles, and distorted reflection cause us to further question images and to not take media narratives at face value. Although the use of text in Telex Iran is relatively sparse, the narrative of the photo book is set in motion by the text-based messages, telexes, between Perez and his editors in Paris and New York. Perez replaced the traditional captions detailing the time and place of the event with non-sequential telexes, thereby supplying both the photojournalist and the viewer with a sense of agency, often stripped away in the editorial process. The standard captions detailing a single viewpoint of the event is now left up to our interpretation, multiplying the meaning of both the photograph and the documented event. As a scholar, Amy Lifford succinctly puts it, quote, "No single voice would or could emerge from Perez's account," unquote. The telexes also make the viewer aware of Perez's subjectivity as he documents the events under the demands of the photo agency. The decision to include the telexes reveals the behind-the-scenes production of these images, thereby providing a sense of transparency that heightens the objectivity of the photographs, making them feel more truthful. According to Perez, quote, "Objectivity means to be honest about one's subjectivity," unquote. Throughout the photo book, the telexes are unified by the tension between Magnum editors trying to get the work published and the photographer's desire for his work to be framed in an accurate light. The spread is a case in point. According to Perez's telex, we see a bound man being falsely labeled as a hostage in the embassy on American television, when it actually is of an actor from a training session from how to take hostages from Iranian TV. This is one of the only captions in Telex Iran that corresponds directly to the image, but it presents a strong point made by Perez on the power and misuse of captioning. Perez's use of text throughout the book constantly reflects back to the production and reproduction of his own images. Take, for example, a spread of two images of an arms market in Kurdistan and protest posters outside the US Embassy. Paired below Perez's message to his editors that he is out of money and wants to come home, and the reply that he must stay in order to photograph the rumored release of the hostages. While the gap between the text and the image on the page separates our own interpretation of the image juxtaposition from Perez's background narrative, we are reminded from the text that this body of work remains linked to the journalism industry. Other texts from Perez's editors mention the interest and subsequent failure to get his work published in major periodicals like Life. The typewriter font enacts another meta quality that reflects Perez's work as being in the draft phase, not yet finalized in glossy print form. Perez ultimately granted himself greater autonomy by compiling his photographs into a photo book, but Telex Iran does not foreclose the meaning of the images. By incorporating a limited amount of text as it relates to his own subjective position, Perez breaks away from the journalistic practice of captioning to maintain the open-endedness of the image. All right, so third publication. Bahman Jalali's Days of Blood, Days of Fire documents the Iranian Revolution from an entirely different perspective than Perez's Telex Iran. as Jalali and his collaborators record the revolution in the thick of protest from an inside perspective. The visual cues of fences and windows that signal the photographer's separation and telex Iran are gone. Days of Blood, Days of Fire covers the 64-day high point of the revolution from December 10th, 1978 to February 11th, 1979, when millions of Iranians took to the street of Tehran to protest the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah and call for the return of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. In comparison to the photojournalists who traveled to Tehran to document the revolution for media spectacle, the photographers at Days of Blood, Days of Fire captured the event free from outside influence. Oh, oops, I'm so sorry. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, following an exhibition at the University of Tehran's College of Farabi, where anyone with photographs related to the revolution could mount them, the literary critic and publisher Khurram Imami inspired Jalali to preserve the exhibition by publishing a book. In order to uphold the thoughtfulness of the image, the truthfulness of the image, Imami also inspired Jalali and his collaborators to print their images alongside newspaper headlines, political slogans, and graffiti, the textual documents of the revolution. It is also important to note that Days of Blood, Days of Fire stems from a period of publishing in Iran known as the Spring of Freedom, when censorship restrictions temporarily lifted following the revolution. The photo book was the first publication of Imami's newly formed press and bookstore, Zemine, which published 2 editions in 1979, before the third was blocked. However, as the artist researcher Hana Tarabi has noted, who by the way wrote an excellent essay for the political section of Flashpoint, Zemine still managed to distribute 32,000 copies. Throughout the photo book, black and white photographs surround blocks of revolutionary text. Within certain spreads, image and text correspond to reflect both the content and emotion of the documents. Here, the image of the hand charts a range of feelings and actions. The small photograph depicting bloody handprints is printed above an excerpt from a letter by Ayatollah Khomeini that alludes to the stained blood hands of the enemy. At one side, we see a protester holding his face in grief, and at the other, we see handwritten graffiti on the back of an ambulance that calls for armed resistance. For the topic of text and protest, another particular spread is worth mentioning. 6 photographs by Jalali, Rana Javidi, and Hadi Haraji depict protesters reading documents and graffitiing taglines, revealing the circulation of mottos and manifestos across the city. The captions in the spread reproduce messages calling for the return of Khomeini. A similar message we see a tagger in the process of graffitiing. Central to the composition are people caught in the act of reading, framed against the walls of text made up of various forms of handwriting and printed documents. Protesters embedded the political language of the revolution within the walls of the city, and Days of Blood, Days of Fire preserves those texts as primary source documents. All right, this is publication 4. The British Egyptian photographer Laura El-Tantawi created Al-Shab, the people, to commemorate the 2011 Egyptian revolution, when mass demonstrations erupted across Egypt in the events leading up to the resignation of Mohammad Hosni Mubarak on February 11, 2011. Published 4 years after the revolution, El-Tantawi was compelled to counter the campaigns circulating throughout Egypt that sought to denigrate the movement. With the assistance of her longtime collaborator, Sib, El-Tantawi collaged her photographs of the demonstration in Cairo's Tahrir Square with text and symbols into 32-page newspaper. On the day of its intended publication, the printers refused to print The People because of its content. El-Tantawi subsequently self-published The People and distributed it for free to Egyptians in an act of defiance against the publishing industry, political censorship, and the suppression of historical memory. Within the newspaper, layered photographs engulfed the viewer in intense conflict and expressive color. El-Tantawi and Sib designed the spreads to feel urgent and effective, carefully collaging the photographs with words that connotated a meaning specific to the revolution. A photograph of an arm raised in a peace sign is overlaid with a smaller image of contrails from a squadron of jets and the words ash, which means bread and life in Egyptian Arabic. It also relates to the three demands of the revolution: red, freedom, and social justice. Further on, the hue of the newspaper turns red as people break out in celebration upon the declaration of Mubarak's departure. Elton Talley described the event, quote, "I saw nothing but red after the event. Fireworks lit the sky, flames lit people's eyes. It was a whirlwind of fleeting images and sounds," unquote. The script of the superimposed words, social justice, complements the forms of moving figures, reflecting that this moment was reached through the actions of the people. Further spreads mediate the rejoiceful moments with pain and violence. We see a blood-soaked sidewalk overlaid with the word martyrs, the murdered and the wounded, and the loved ones who mourn. A kaleidoscopic collage reveals the range of emotions covered within the newspaper. The word revolution holds down the 12 disorienting photographs like a headline. Our eyes then move through each composition like text on a page, attempting to read images as expressions shift from celebration to disbelief. Some of the protesters begin to rest, indicating that the action has begun to settle. Yet one person stares off into the distance, a look forward from the revolution with uncertainty for what is to follow. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody. Now for us, it is going to have a little Q&A. We're going to have the three speakers come up front.
Hi, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you Kyle, Arthur, and Kris. That was really terrific. And I just want to, before I ask any questions, I want to open it up to the audience first. Are there questions that you might have? Yeah.
I got like 50.
Okay. I'm going to hand the mic because we're recording and that's the way we can hear it.
I just want to thank Russet for putting this amazing group together. Thank you. The images, it's so resonant, gorgeous, and haunting, and weirdly hopeful that there's power to these images. How did you get the book down to a manageable size? There were thousands of possibilities. What were your parameters?
Well, I want to point out that Arthur wrote the introduction to the book. Kris contributed A Bleak Reality, and Kyle was a researcher, summary writer for the book. When you see both Kris and Arthur's presentations, there's material that's expanded beyond. There's no way for us to have covered, any kind of complete materials. And it is a suggestion to open the dialogue, which is why when we were planning tonight's presentation, they all said, can we talk about things that are not in the book? We said, absolutely, please do, because it needs to go beyond, especially now. I mean, history repeats itself. We look at these past protests, and we hopefully learn a point of mobilizing again, is my hope. So you're all quiet? Or?
Thank you all. It was really amazing. Kris, I have a question about your upcoming book for next month. How did you gather the imagery from the West Bank? Were they taken by you? Were they pulled from archives?
No, a person named Rahab Nazal is there teaching and walking the streets So she's been there since about a year and a half, photographing and working. Yeah. So it's a project based one person's story about what they've seen so far.
What you're doing is so important. Do you think, I'm doing one on fragment, and about censorship, this coming, or have you felt the effects of that? Has that hindered you? Because the Washington host now will no longer have opinions that Bezos doesn't agree with. That's the first step. And Kennedy Center, reaching into the arts itself, which of course if you're poor people's arts always lead the way out. So what are your idea is, how do we deal with this going forward? How do we circumvent censorship? That's sort of the way I'm feeling it. Do we put it away a while? What are your plans? You're the ones who've been very strong and courageous.
I'll just go ahead and say, like, make work that they hate.
Yeah, I think censorship emboldens if we're thinking about it correctly. If you make something, if anybody is making something today that feels so powerful it must be suppressed, then amplify it. And if you are a collector of books or images or art, and you hear about work that is so powerful it's being destroyed or suppressed, support the artist, support the living artist, buy that work from that person, and archive that work, make sure it remains a powerful record of our moment, and yeah, just amplify people who are living the experience of the injustice and documenting it themselves.
I just want to bring up a term I learned recently called like compulsory compliance, and so to just not comply to doing things when you think you're going to be stopped, just keep going. And then also, like I talked a lot about a lot of publications that were self-published, so that seems to also be like a really important means of circumventing censorship.
Thank you so much for these really timely and interesting talks. I had a question mostly inspired by Kyle's presentation, but I think I'm really curious to hear how all of you address this, which is that each of these books play with elements of collage as well as portraiture. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you saw collage functioning maybe politically differently or having a different valence from some of the images that are starker and kind of that head-on portraiture perspective. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think about the juxtaposition I did between Mount Pictorial Record and the cover of Kenyatta, where with Kenyatta it's a really straightforward photograph, whereas the cover with Mount Pictorial Record, it shows all these images that are used in the book, clipped and collaged, really kind of like stuffed within this frame, really trying to push this singular message. So yeah, I mean, that's how I was seeing collage in terms of how it's used in propaganda, right? It's really making us think about how these images are really forced with this single message.
I have no collages.
I'd like to say something briefly just about collage and what happens with that. I mean, basically, collage, photomontage, and what the situationists would call détournement, which was to take an existing image and to repurpose it and maybe give it a new text, to subvert a consumer culture or a pop culture image and to give it radical new meaning. That this is just, what we're experiencing. So we have, photography now for, somebody help me do the math, however many years, but now, going on several hundred years. And we can control it, we can physically manipulate it, we can repurpose it, there is no image that has a set text. Every image that is affiliated with a particular piece of text can be remixed and reinscribed by every viewer. And all of us in some ways can circulate that in our limited fashion electronically, but we can also make a physical copy of it and give it out at our laundromat. Like, if you're worried about censorship and your messages being disappeared by an algorithm online, print a stack of those images and go to a place where people, are spending time because they have to be. Go to a laundromat, go to a post office, walk down the street, and that's a way to get your message out if you want to. Put them on light posts, project it on the side of a building. There are so many ways we can use collage and montage and the repurposing and remixing of images to tell the stories we want to tell.
Hello. So I have a very odd question. There is some aesthetic and there's a lot of mechanisms how any of this is like applied. What do you consider is exactly the opposite in propaganda? Are there affinities in the mechanism how things are structured? I'm not talking about the agendas, but just the mechanisms of propaganda versus the mechanisms of revolutionary work.
I mean, I can take a stab at answering that, but I would invite.
I would say those two things are very similar depending on what side you're on. So, you know, it's propaganda to you maybe, but not me, or vice versa. So the images are they just need to be strong, right? I mean, that's kind of what we've seen in propaganda from like China, Russia, here, that it's like strongman shit. So like, I mean, mostly the fighting against that strongman stuff doesn't really include the strongmen, so that's kind of the only thing that's not the same. But I think the motives are the same, like we want change and the other side wants change too. But in the arts, I don't know, I mean, that's a hard one.
I think if I understand your question correctly, you're asking, is the mechanism the same on the side of resistance or on the side of kind of state power reinforcing and replicating itself? And maybe it's similar, right? I mean, but I mean, I think it's like in comedy, you know, joke is only good if you're punching up rather than punching down. And I think that's sort of it. It's sort of like the power dynamic of materials for resistance, you know, strikes upward, and the power dynamic for materials of propaganda clamps down, and it reinforces you know, a version, a conservative or a, you know, patriarchal version of strongman reality. I always think, like, you know, the psychology of a system of oppression is always rooted in kind of like, you know, like masculine dominance hierarchy, and that always seems to be the through line when you look at images of propaganda.
No, when I just saw the aesthetics of this, they did remind me exactly of the opposite agendas, also using very similar techniques. Just how do you get attention, how do you accentuate something? And I was just wondering if there's something very inherent in protest, in the aesthetics of protest, whereas that's not happening in propaganda. And I'm not talking about the agenda and the pushing down and the pushing up.
I actually want to kind of take a jump from this question to kind of talk about the issue of typography and the visual aesthetics. I mean, Arthur, you showed and babies. There are other posters that I think of, like, you know, Danny Lyons Now with the hand extending straight up to the letters, and so, as well as like the AIDS poster, Donald Moffat, He Kills Me, with a picture of Ronald Reagan and a bullseye next to him. Or even the cover of Kenyatta, the kind of bold hand holding the whip with the typography, you know, across the top in very sans serif black letters, or, you know, the typography that's found within the pictures of RNC and DNC. And so my question is, how does type and kind of typographic concerns give shape to that voice?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I was thinking a lot about the Danny Lyon poster with Now, and there's this article by Lee Rayford that talks about it, and you know, so these posters, they were made with photographs by Danny Lyon, who was a photographer for SNCC, and they were circulated widely, and he made sets of them, and so the photograph, yeah, it shows a person reaching up and grabbing the Now sign, and it's a documentary photograph from like March of Washington, 1963. And what Rayford talks about is that now it brings us really to the present in a way, like, but not in like a documentary sense. Like, it's not just like, oh, we're looking at this photograph and like this is what it's documenting us the event. It's kind of like what Arthur talks about, the aesthetics of urgency, where we see this photograph that like is really about like racial injustice, past and present, and then also what's happening right now, right? Like it brings us to the present, and this call to action. So yeah, that's like that poster. Like I was thinking about that a lot.
I think this is just one of those things where, you know, we can really get into the finer grain psychologically of the relationship between text and image, and how both text and image separately are forms of mediation, you know, that stand between our subjectivity and the world, and how, you know, they become frames for processing the world. And then when you combine them together, you know, they bleed into one another and affect one another. A word like now means something different when there's a hand reaching up to it, you know, as part of a struggle for, you know, for civil rights. And it's a black man's hand reaching up to the word now, you know, and Danny Line takes that picture and it circulates as part of a portfolio of images for SNCC. You know, the meaning of the word has changed, and the meaning of the image has changed. And so, you know, the interpenetration between these kind of realms of representation, you know, I mean, I don't know, we could get into the Baudrillard and all of the philosophy, you know, to help us kind of understand how that shifts our perception. But, you know, I think ultimately these things are tools. And if we use these tools effectively to communicate, you know, the urgency of our struggles, whoever we are, you know, there's a lot of power and there's a lot of play in that power to take a word and transform an image, maybe invert an image or amplify an image.
I think he did it.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Hi, this is maybe a question for everyone, but I'm thinking specifically Kris, the format of the photo books. And what does it mean to have a tactile engagement with a photograph now, especially because we're in this age of mechanical reproducibility when we're in this digital era and how we engage with photos is mostly in that digital format. So what does it mean, I'm thinking about, when the paper changes halfway through the book or the covers, to have this kind of tactile sense of a photograph?
I'm just like a printer, so like for me, the images online are really great, but there's so many of them that it's a wash for the most part. So once you're getting back to putting something in the book that there will be 500, 1,000 copies of in the world, there's way less people can see it than the internet. So I feel like you have to, well, personally just don't show people stuff they'll forget. I mean, like, I think how we work with artists is, you know, we get large groups of images in, hundreds of images, and I will go through and like try to make the book as small as humanly possible. I mean, really, like no extra. I think that is really important. It's hard for people to remember images. So if I can make a book with 12 images, I would. It's not. No one wants that. But yeah, for us, it's like keep on paper, show people exactly what you want them to see and nothing else. No, nothing that like flees the idea or like kind of doesn't make sense within this realm. Having 200 pictures in the middle of a book is a lot of information to like kind of to put through. If it was the same paper, it would be like a book where you just stop. I think you don't even look at it anymore. But to switch it up, maybe you will come back later, or you know, give it its own time because there's a lot of text in there also. So like I think like switching papers, switching the way things look, maybe having text on different materials is really helpful for like breaking apart like the monotony of what a book could be. Yeah.
Okay, one last question, and then we're gonna close out.
Were photos included in the book that you know were manipulated? Did you allow in stuff that, I mean, you know, obviously you guys will have tons more examples, but that you found that we learned years later were staged, or that we learned years later were manipulated? Did that make it into the book, or no? What were your parameters for that sort of thing? Where it's super powerful, but it turns out to not have been what happened that day?
I'm not thinking of one that we remember was, but I'm sure there were stage photographs, and yeah. There, I mean, it comes to the present, so there's obviously images that were, there's nothing that I know of that was AI generated specifically, but yeah.
What I was asking earlier and I wasn't clear, what were your parameters for what to include in the book? How did you even choose out of the thousands and thousands of gorgeous possibilities?
Olga and I did a reading room with the Magnum Foundation in, I believe it was 2017, called Awake. And we worked with the ICP library, and we did an open call where we asked people to send in zines, and it was a resistance library. And it was a weekend pop-up. I believe we also did it with Image Text Ithaca. Olga took it up to Ithaca, New York. And we kind of shelved it for a while. And as the elections were coming up, we just felt that that project needed to be revived. And so we started with the materials from that, but we then just went searching globally. And at first we thought it was going to be books, but the idea that, and I think Arthur said this, that, you know, tool, what is a tool of protest versus what is a documented protest, that became a driving force as we selected materials. And certainly, you know, the poster like the Now poster or And Babies is a tool of protest. It's held up at, or the New York war crimes is a tool of protest, you give it out. So that started to drive a little bit, the suggestion. We also just reached out to the essayist. Arthur certainly suggested things. Kyle kind of came over, was looking through things. You know, Kris's zines I picked up at the Pratt book fair. There were things gotten at the, you know, in the East Village book fair, or there was a librarian in Sao Paulo at the Instituto Maria Salas who had put together protest materials from Brazil and sent it. So it's incomplete, and we're very clear that it's incomplete and that it's a spark and it's a discussion. And purposely, you know, I wanted to thank these guys because they talked about materials that are not necessarily in Flashpoint as well, and that's really important because it is not finite. And the idea in creating the publication for us was that it was like a telephone book, and telephone books are not complete. They come out every year, and they're, you know, they get updates. And so I see, you know, we live in a moment right now where it's so volatile, things are so in flux, that these are just sparks of the past that hopefully, you know, we look at and glean some sense of, you know, what is a way to move forward, what is a response, how have protests in the past handled these issues as tools or documents. And, you know, I think Kris documents, you know, beautifully in his zines and publications. And I liked in particular that text and image, because Dave Solo suggested this panel, and I'm just sorry he's not here, he's away in Europe, so the timing did not work. But, you know, there's so many different ways that text and image are used. There are captions, telex, communications, there are, you know, bold words on top of it, or there were images that have words within them. And so I think this was just a small sampling from these three presenters to see those three very different types of way of presenting text and its intersections. So I wanted to thank Kyle Canter, Arthur Fournier, and Kris Graves for presenting. Kris brought books, which are on the back table. And so the material he showed, you can also leaf through it in person. And there are also copies of the Flashpoint books. So thank you very much, and thank you, Eve and the Grolier Club. We're very appreciative.